Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man era lasted only 2 solo films, but its history is much larger than 2 release dates. This rebuilt video follows the 2010 reboot, Mark Webb's relationship first approach, the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, mechanical web shooters, native 3D photography, New York production, the expanding villain universe, Gwen Stacy's death, the announced sequels and spin-offs, the 2014 Sony Pictures cyber attack, and the 2015 decision to collaborate with Marvel Studios. It then follows Andrew's return in No Way Home and the way one rescue scene transformed an unfinished story into an emotional legacy. Together, these chapters trace how Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man moved from an ambitious reboot to an unfinished franchise and finally to an emotional return that changed how many viewers remembered his performance. The Andrew Garfield era began because Sam Raimi's planned Spider-Man 4 did not move forward. In January 2010, Sony ended that continuation and announced a new film centered on Peter Parker's high school years. The reboot was not an attempt to erase the popularity of Tobey Maguire. It was a business and creative reset built around a new cast, a younger Peter, and a different tone. Mark Webb, known for 500 Days of Summer, was chosen to direct. That choice signaled that the new series would place unusual weight on awkward attraction, emotional uncertainty, and the relationship between Peter and Gwen Stacy. The studio was rebuilding a major effects franchise, but the emotional center was intended to feel smaller and more personal. Andrew Garfield was cast as Peter Parker in 2010, and Sony officially announced Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy that October. Mark Webb said their chemistry during testing was stunning and made Stone the clear choice. That chemistry became the strongest element of both films. Garfield's Peter was sharper, more restless, and more openly wounded than Tobey Maguire's version. Stone's Gwen was not simply waiting to be rescued, she was scientifically capable, direct, and willing to challenge Peter's choices. Their performances also benefited from timing and rhythm that felt less like formal superhero dialogue and more like two people interrupting, teasing, and discovering what they wanted to say. The relationship worked so well that later franchise machinery often felt most successful when it stopped and allowed Andrew and Emma to share the frame. Mark Webb wanted the new Spider-Man to look handmade rather than inherited from a polished superhero system. Peter builds mechanical web shooters, restoring a major element from the comics and making his scientific intelligence visible. The first suit was designed to make Garfield appear longer, leaner, and more acrobatic. Its narrow eyes, textured surface, and unusual patterning separated it immediately from Raimi's costume. The production also used Spider-Man's mask as a performance tool. Garfield described the disguise as a protective layer that allowed Peter to become more playful and bold. The second film redesigned the suit again, moving toward larger white eyes and a more classic silhouette. Across both films, the goal was to connect movement, costume, and attitude so that Spider-Man felt like Peter's freer, more expressive self. Sony announced that The Amazing Spider-Man was being shot entirely in 3D rather than converted only after photography. The production combined digital environments and character animation with live-action stunt work and large physical sets. A major Williamsburg Bridge sequence used an enormous set that allowed performers, cars, cables, and practical action to interact before digital extensions completed the location. The visual effects challenge was not simply making Spider-Man fly through the city. It was giving his movement weight, hesitation, and acceleration that matched Garfield's performance. The film often lets the camera travel with Spider-Man instead of observing him from far away, making the swinging feel more immediate. This mix of practical scale, native stereo photography, and digital motion was part of the reboot's attempt to make a familiar hero feel physically new. The first film was marketed around an untold side of Peter Parker's origin. Instead of focusing only on the spider bite and Uncle Ben, the story connected Peter's parents to Oscorp, Dr. Kurt Connors, and the research that eventually creates the lizard. This gave the reboot a mystery structure, but it also created an obligation the series never completely fulfilled. The theatrical film explains pieces of the research while leaving the larger truth about Richard and Mary Parker unresolved. Deleted material and later sequel revelations expanded the idea, but the storyline remained less emotionally complete than Peter's relationships with Uncle Ben, Aunt May, and Gwen. The parents' mystery is therefore important for two reasons. It distinguishes the reboot, and it demonstrates how long-term franchise planning can make a film promise answers that future movies may never have the chance to deliver. The Amazing Spider-Man opened in July 2012 and proved that audiences would accept a new live-action, Peter only 5 years after Spider-Man 3. Its most distinctive achievements were not the repeated origin beats. They were the relationship between Peter and Gwen, the return of mechanical web shooters, Garfield's physical performance, and the decision to make Spider-Man funny while masked. The film also introduced a more morally complicated Kirk Connors, whose desire to heal himself becomes a plan to transform others. At the same time, the story carried visible evidence of editing and restructuring. Some mysteries were emphasized in marketing more than they were resolved in the finished cut. The result is a film that successfully establishes a new personality and visual language, while also planting questions that the sequel would inherit under much greater franchise pressure. When production began in February 2013, Sony announced that The Amazing Spider-Man 2 would be the first film in the franchise shot entirely in New York City and New York State. Locations extended across Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island, and upstate New York, with Rochester used for a major vehicle sequence before visual effects transformed the streets. Soundstage work also remained inside the state. This mattered creatively because Spider-Man's identity is inseparable from New York, and the sequel often feels more open, colorful, and geographically specific than the first film. It also mattered industrially. Contemporary coverage described it as the largest production mounted in New York State at that time. The film's scale can therefore be seen not only in its visual effects, but in the decision to build the production around Spider-Man's actual home. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is simultaneously a romance, a tragedy, an Electro origin, a Harry Osborn story, a continuation of the Parker family mystery, and a launch platform for future villains. Each element has individual strengths. Jamie Foxx gives Max Dillon loneliness before the character becomes a living electrical effect. Dane DeHaan's Harry brings urgency and resentment to Peter's oldest friendship. Paul Giamatti's Rhino functions largely as a promise of more villains to come. The problem is accumulation. Oscorp begins to feel less like one corporation in one story and more like a warehouse containing the next several movies. The film's ending even reveals equipment associated with future enemies. The sequel therefore became a demonstration of a wider industry trend. The present movie was increasingly expected to advertise a cinematic universe that did not yet exist. Electro required the filmmakers to combine performance, makeup, lighting, digital skin, and large-scale environment work. Jamie Foxx's transformation involved hours of physical makeup, but the completed character also depended heavily on visual effects to make electricity move through and around his body. The Times Square confrontation turns advertisements, screens, cables, police lights, and crowds into part of the action. It is a sequence about power in both meanings of the word. Max suddenly possesses enormous energy while also discovering that public attention can turn against him. The effects are intentionally bright and theatrical, matching the sequel's more comic book visual style. Yet the sequence also reveals the challenge of digital villains. The more the character becomes electricity and light, the more important Fox's earlier human vulnerability becomes to keep the spectacle connected to a person. The emotional climax of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 adapts one of the most famous tragedies in Spider-Man comics, the death of Gwen Stacy. The film relocates the fall to a clock tower and turns time itself into part of the design. Gears, hands, and collapsing mechanisms surround Peter as he tries to stop both Harry and gravity. The sequence is effective because the audience already understands the relationship being lost. Gwen has made plans for Oxford, Peter has finally chosen to follow her, and the future appears open only moments before it disappears. Andrew Garfield's performance after the fall strips away the franchise machinery. The scene then follows Peter through grief and withdrawal before Gwen's recorded graduation speech helps him move again. The film's most lasting achievement is therefore also the moment that makes a simple continuation emotionally difficult. Sony's future plans were not merely fan rumors. In December 2013, the studio publicly announced a group of writers developing The Amazing Spider-Man 3, Venom, and the Sinister Six as parts of an expanded story. In July 2014, Sony gave the Sinister Six a November 2016 release date and moved The Amazing Spider-Man 3 to 2018. Earlier plans had also included a fourth Amazing Spider-Man film. Those announcements show how aggressively the studio was thinking beyond the 2014 sequel. They do not prove that every leaked idea, casting wish, or proposed plot had been approved. Development is a process of drafts, alternatives, and negotiations. The accurate language is therefore important. Several projects were officially in development, and some had dates, but they were not completed films waiting on a shelf. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 contains visible seeds for a villain-centered universe. Oscorp stores equipment associated with Dr. Octopus and the Vulture. Rhino arrives at the ending, and Gustav Fiers begins assembling a team. Sony publicly developed Venom and the Sinister Six, with Drew Goddard attached to write and later direct the villain team film. Other concepts, including a female-led project, were reported during the same period. The strategy was unusual because the spin-offs could potentially place villains at the center before this Spider-Man received a third solo chapter. That does not mean the filmmakers lacked ideas. Goddard later described his approach as deliberately wild and different, but the structure depended on many projects surviving long enough to support one another. When the central series changed direction, the connecting web could no longer hold the same shape. Late in 2014, Sony Pictures suffered a destructive cyber attack that disabled systems and exposed an enormous amount of confidential company and employee data. The incident affected far more than Spider-Man. It disrupted the studio, drew an FBI response, and released private emails, documents, unreleased material, and personal information into public view. Spider-Man's strategy became part of the coverage because internal discussions about sequels, spin-offs, and a possible relationship with Marvel were suddenly visible outside the company. This video will not reproduce private emails or treat stolen correspondence as entertainment. The historically important point is the disruption. A studio already trying to manage an ambitious franchise was forced into a security and organizational crisis. In 2026, Sinister Six writer-director Drew Goddard said directly that his Spider-Man project went down because of the hack. The Sony hack created a lasting confusion between official plans, private discussion, and internet rumor. A stolen email can show that someone suggested an idea. It does not automatically prove a contract, a final screenplay, a cast commitment, or a finished studio decision. The most responsible way to discuss the leaked Spider-Man material is to separate levels of certainty. Sony's public press releases prove that The Amazing Spider-Man 3, Venom, and the Sinister Six were in official development, and that Sinister Six received a release date. Contemporary reporting and later interviews can document additional discussions. But lists of celebrity names, speculative crossovers, and rapidly changing plot ideas should be described as proposals or conversations unless stronger evidence exists. The hack matters historically without requiring us to repeat private messages or exaggerate every brainstorm into a canceled masterpiece. No single event explains the end of Andrew Garfield's solo series. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 earned substantial worldwide box office, but its critical response was mixed and its franchise setup drew criticism. Sony's universe plans were ambitious and dependent on multiple interconnected projects. The 2014 hack then created a major operational and leadership crisis. Goddard now says it directly killed his Sinister Six film. In February 2015, Sony and Marvel Studios announced a new collaboration. The next Spider-Man would first appear inside the Marvel Cinematic Universe, while Sony would continue to finance, distribute, own, and retain final creative control of the solo films. That agreement did not merely postpone The Amazing Spider-Man 3. It introduced a new Peter Parker and a new creative direction, ending Garfield's planned continuation before his character received a completed third chapter. Andrew Garfield did not appear as Spider-Man in a new feature between The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in 2014 and No Way Home in 2021. His return worked because the film did not pretend those missing years were empty. This older Peter carries Gwen's death, loneliness, and the suggestion that he became harsher after losing her. He also arrives with humor, generosity, and an immediate willingness to help another Peter. No Way Home uses the multiverse as more than a parade of references. Tobey Maguire's Peter represents endurance, Andrew's represents grief and unfinished recovery, and Tom Holland's represents a crisis still unfolding. Garfield's performance became one of the film's strongest surprises because he could acknowledge the pain of the abandoned series without turning the character into bitterness alone. The most important moment in Andrew Garfield's return is not a joke or a villain fight. When MJ falls from the Statue of Liberty structure, Andrew's Peter reaches her and lands safely. The scene deliberately recalls his failure to save Gwen, but it does not erase Gwen or replace one woman with another. The emotion comes from his recognition that this time he was able to stop the fall. Garfield plays the aftermath almost without dialogue. His face carries relief, grief, and disbelief at once. The rescue became a form of closure that The Amazing Spider-Man 3 might never have delivered in exactly this way. It also demonstrates why legacy storytelling works best when a reference changes a character in the present rather than merely reminding the audience of an older scene. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man is now remembered differently than he was when the solo series ended. The first film is often praised for its physicality and romance, while the second is frequently reevaluated for Garfield and Stone's performances, even by viewers who still find the franchise setup overloaded. No Way Home gave Andrew a public return and an emotional resolution without declaring that every abandoned plan should be restored. As of this video's July 2026 production, Sony has not officially announced The Amazing Spider-Man 3. That distinction matters because enthusiasm, interviews, and fan campaigns are not release announcements. Andrew's legacy does not depend on pretending a third film is guaranteed. His version already demonstrates that an interrupted adaptation can continue through memory, performance, and one carefully chosen scene, while still leaving room for a future story if the studios ever decide to make one.